Hey, everybody, and welcome to Narrative Live. We'll have Tracy join us in just a second. But first, it's hard to escape that sinking feeling lately that something really wrong is happening to our republic. The wheels are sort of coming off. The new Attorney General was blatantly lying, not once or twice, but 5 or 6 times. And not just little white lies, wholesale deception of a possible crime. Did the president obstruct justice? Did the AG leak the report to the White House? We just don't know the answers to these questions. Now the executive branch is blatantly ignoring congressional subpoenas in an effort to cover up the most significant judicial report in the country's history. Is it a constitutional crisis? It is beginning to look like one, and I hate to be a buzzkill on a Monday, but there are very few options or paths out of this particular crisis. Now, thankfully, we have some really smart people to help us digest all of this here this week, and as I do this and quickly do that, I can introduce you to have been telling everyone who you are, but you can't hear me. So
Nope.
I can hear you.
Tracy, now you can. Tracy,
Hi,
Tracy said-
Sam. Great to
Thank
see
you.
everybody.
I'm sorry about that. Gary Darden is professor of history from Fairleigh Dickinson University, New Jersey, and Jeannie Zaino from
Hello.
Iona University. Through all my favorite people alive in one place to answer all these very, very complex questions we have on the on everything to do with the impeachment process or possible impeachment process. So let me ask you first, because it's an important historical context. On a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is like we're in Trumplandia and 10 is the Constitution is crumbling beneath our feet, where are we on that scale of 1 to 10 right now as we look at a attorney general who's refusing to cooperate with the legislature? Gary.
I think we're probably at a 4. I think it can get to 6 pretty quick.
Can you think of anything that's historically similar to this one?
Well, if
Well,
you
then rate
look
is
up
high?
behind me here, there's a portrait of Lincoln, and I think we have a conflict between the executive and the legislative branch, and this happened with Andrew Johnson and a Republican Congress in 1868, and this certainly happened with Nixon, who was Republican, and the Democrats had full control of the House as well as the Senate. But the Supreme Court stepped in favor of the legislative branch, and in 1868 we had an impeachment trial in which Johnson stayed in office by 1 vote. So yes, we've been down comparable roads.
Jeannie, what do you think in terms of a scale of 1 to 10?
You know, I think we've had a constitutional crisis in this country that precedes Donald Trump by many, many decades, if not centuries, and will live past him. A lot of my work has to do with the founding and the Madisonian government that was created. So in my mind, this is exactly what is the outcome of what Madison created, which is this constant struggle between the executive branch and the legislative branch. And if you don't want that struggle, it is incumbent on you to join with people who want to rethink the structure of the Constitution. And whether those are people like Lloyd Cutler, to bring up a name from so long ago in the Carter administration, or many others who have said that the way the system is structured makes getting things done very, very difficult, that is an outgrowth of what we have. Because let's not forget, there is no Donald Trump if you don't have many people frustrated with the inability of Congress to act on key issues when he descends down that elevator, and we all watched this, and talks about immigration. We're talking 20, 30 years of an absolute crisis in immigration that goes unaddressed. He picks up on that. So in my mind, this is part and parcel of much bigger forces at work. And I think the biggest mistake we make, and I've done a lot of media with you, Zev and Tracy, and the biggest mistake the media makes is to focus squarely on Donald Trump as if he was the beginning of this or will be the end of this, because he is but a little minute part of a much bigger story that must be told.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot to be said around that, and well said, Jeannie, in terms of Madison. He predicted that this might even happen. I was reading earlier on that he said that the government would stop working, the democracy would stop working when so much wealth was concentrated amongst so few. And yet he didn't offer any solutions, but he did have the foresight to think that this might happen from the system he was creating.
Yeah, and let's be clear. I mean, what the framers were doing is they were guarding against a tyranny of the kind they had lived under with the monarchy. They wanted to guard against that. But you go back to the debates at the framing, and where our founders had the biggest difficulty was how to construct an executive branch that wasn't led by a potential monarch or tyrant. And everything from the Electoral College to the design of the executive branch reflects a real problem with the founders' thinking as it pertains to creating a government that can, on one hand, act, and a government that won't descend into a tyranny of some sort. And it's not an easy thing to manipulate or to create, and they did their best, but it is fraught with difficulty, and we are seeing those difficulties live themselves out. And I would suggest that whether Donald Trump was in office or not, they would, in many ways, still be very clear to us today in 2019, with or without a Donald Trump presidency.
So interesting. Tracy, what do you think? 1 to 10, or and
Well, I
anything
was
comparable?
going to look at it from a little different perspective. Don't know if it's a 1 or a 10, but what I can tell you is that I'm getting the feeling from the people we interact with on a daily basis on Twitter and other social media that those people consider it to be an 8, 9, or 10. Now that we have a 24/7 news cycle, everybody's getting the stories all day, and it's overwhelming to people. So I feel like the majority of people feel like that I interact with, we're at a 7 or an 8.
Yes, I think, and sometimes people remind me, and I think it's important to remember that Twitter is not the rest of America, and maybe in America people are perceiving more of a 2 or 3 or 4, but certainly where we live a lot of the time on Twitter, it does feel like a much higher on the Richter scale, and it'll be interesting to see whether the Twitter noise is actually able to influence the rest of the conversation. You're also going to point out about Nancy Pelosi and your interest in
I think
the
what
press
really
conference last
struck
week.
what really struck me was Nancy's press conference last week. She didn't do the usual partisan thing. Instead, she kind of made us a mind map, something to think about. So we're going to play a clip, but she took us from Barr's hearings to what could be the essential fault right now in our system. So let's take a look.
Connecting of the dots between Mitch McConnell, the Republican agenda in Congress, such as it is, the special interest agenda fueled by dark special interest money. That's what that hearing was about. It wasn't about technicalities. It wasn't about who wrote the letter and how he characterized the letter. That's interesting. But what is deadly serious about it is the Attorney General of the United States of America was not telling the truth to the Congress of the United States. That's a crime.
Speaker Pelosi,
That's Nancy.
what kinds of consequences?
That's really an interesting. In the rest of the press conference, she also talks a lot about special interests and about dark money and how McConnell is the Grim Reaper. And she specifically points to McConnell, Barr, and Trump as sort of the special interests that have gotten, that they own them, that they own those three. And with the ownership of those three, anything that needs to get through will get through, because once you've got McConnell passing or killing any bill in the Senate, you've got the AG who's basically running against the law, not running with the law, and Trump, who's so beholden to special interests. It's quite a troika of people who are involved in selling the government to special interests. Jeannie, what do you think about the role of special interests in the current makeup of our system, current makeup of our government?
It's one of the many things that has frustrated people, and rightly so. And I just want to echo what both you and Tracy just said about Twitter, and not just Twitter, but people's frustration. It is very, very real, and we need to take that very seriously. You're right, Zev, it doesn't reflect, as a social scientist, we have to say it doesn't reflect the feelings of everybody in the country, but there certainly is a great deal of frustration for good reason. And a lot of that gets back to things like, gerrymandering, or the amount of special interest money in the system, which Nancy Pelosi is rightly talking about. And it's true, I would just say, on both sides of the aisle, and we have to be very clear about that. So, it is true that anybody who gets into Congress today, the cost, I mean, if you just think about it in the simplest terms, the amount of money it takes to win a House seat or a Senate seat, certainly it's astronomical. So there are two choices. You are independently wealthy and you're not beholden to special interests, or you raise money from very wealthy people and interests. That's how you get there, and that's how you stay there. So until people want to have a serious conversation in this country about things like campaign finance reform, and we saw Kristen Gillibrand and others out on the campaign trail just in the last few days making this case, and of course it's been talked about Joe Biden and others going back years, until we have a serious conversation about those issues, when it costs $15 million on average to win a Senate seat, of course you're going to have people in there who are beholden to dark money. Right. That is the way the system is structured. And I always tell my students, we have to be careful not to talk about these as bad people. It's the system that is corrupted and the system that needs to be changed, so that you invite people to operate in a way where they're not beholden like this. Because to get their jobs and keep them, they need that money.
And it goes back to what you were saying about how Trump was a symptom, really, of what's going on in the system,
exactly.
rather than just the main event that we're looking at right now. Gary, how did it all start? Is it just the slow seeping in of dark money? Is it Citizens United, or has it gone back to the beginning of our republic?
Well, I think it's Citizens United, but I want to add to what was being said here. Social media is a very different device in the 2010s than it was in the 2000s, let alone before it existed in the 1990s. We talked about in our last chat, when you had distilled, edited news by professional journalists, that would sort of temper the mood. So the people were getting news from a Walter Cronkite and not going to echo chambers. And whether it's Fox or MSNBC or however you want to frame it, people they can get news they want to hear to begin with that can inflame existing passions. I think the legal issue is Citizens United, because what it does is the argument went is we went from a system that attempted to move post Watergate into one man, one vote, into $1, one vote. And so Citizens United gave a broad license to allow more money to flood the system. And that is flooding into those congressional and Senate races that you were all talking about. And Citizens United was decided by one vote. And the only way that's going to change is if we get a new ruling or an amendment to the Constitution. The latter is highly unlikely, if not impossible, under the current political climate. And the other issue is gerrymandering. So we've got a lot of House seats that are insensitive to political will. So you either have a very safe conservative seat or you have a very safe liberal seat. And I think when the electorate, as being suggested, actually puts enough onus on this to address gerrymandering and to address the legacy of Citizens United, we're going to be stuck in this mess. And it will not get better.
There have been some recent victories around gerrymandering. We'll see if they extend to all the swing states. But, in places like Ohio and Michigan, there have been some victories which could change the math, at least on the ground there in 2020, which is good news. Would it then follow? How do you get the Supreme Court to look at this again? Or do they have to be convinced by lower court rulings? Is this a Citizens United?
Are you asking me?
I'm asking you. I know it's a tough one, but it's because it's.
Well, yes. I mean, if another case percolates back up, and if the Supreme Court is actually willing to take it, they may not be willing to. The makeup of the court hasn't changed sufficiently, because basically we've seen Scalia's seat be replaced by a conservative. Right. But I don't see Roberts changing his position from 2010 unless the evidence or political will suggests otherwise.
Right. But certainly with Kavanaugh, it's not going to change very much from that previous decision. Tracy, any thoughts about the special money, the dark money, the special interest in our government?
No, I know that we decided that we were also going to take a look at this dark money trail or this special interest trail as it relates to Barr, because there's some things that we found in our research that I think we want to point out.
Yes. And so, let's maybe throw up the graphics because they're kind of fun.
Yeah.
So there's our three amigos, McConnell, Trump, and Barr, who are owned by special money, according to Nancy Pelosi. And we know what those special interests are. Of course, they're tech, fossil fuels, industrialists, social conservatives as well, but also now it seems like Russia is a special interest when it comes to the GOP, and no one seems to care. So that seems to be a real reality in heading into 2020. Now, here is what we learned about Bill Barr. He's not just the Attorney General. He's got a very interesting past, working as a lobbyist, as a counsel to very interesting clients at various law firms. And the most interesting for me is Oleg Deripaska, which I have a bit of a passion about. He's up there in the top left corner. So Barr was a counsel to this company called Kirkland and Ellis. Kirkland and Ellis, at least the London office of Kirkland and Ellis, represented Oleg Deripaska. So it's striking, completely striking, that he was able to render an opinion on the Mueller report when he's so related to Oleg Deripaska. And that's not all. Tracy, do you want to pick one of the other three? And
yeah, let's take a look at our favorite bank, which is Deutsche Bank. And Barr, it turns out, has significant assets between 100,000 and 250,000 with Deutsche Bank.
That is interesting. Howard Lorber, who you see there on the bottom left, is part of the Vector Group. He's a big supporter of Donald Trump, and Barr receives regular dividends from the company because he owns a piece of their pie. Now, Howard Lorber is Russian by origin and also very helpful to Donald Trump when he was setting up his campaign. And the most interesting one, and the one that's really striking to me about Mueller and Barr's rendering of a decision on Mueller, is Alpha Bank. Alpha Bank is very much involved with the Kremlin. Piotr Evan is the head of Alpha Bank and is very, very close to Vladimir Putin. And Bill Barr directly represented him up until recently, before he became the Attorney General. So just in terms of Trump-Russia, there is a very interesting case to be made around whether Bill Barr can even be rendering a judgment, or whether he should be recused from this completely. What do you guys think?
Zev, could I just point out, I just wanted to do a shout out to Christina Mazza, who is a reporter at Newsweek, and she pretty much broke down all of these connections in a great piece. I think it was a couple of weeks ago. So I wanted to give her credit for pointing out all of those connections. And we're also planning on having her on the show. So thanks, Christina.
Jeannie and Gary, what do you think about these very interesting connections to at least Russia in this case? But we'll go into a little bit about the Koch brothers in a second too. What do you think about how conflicted he seems to be?
For me,
Jeannie.
Yeah. So, I don't think it's particularly surprising. And the Senate had the opportunity to delve in when they had the confirmation hearings to all of these ties. They were well known. They were documented. Bill Barr has been around a long time. Everybody in Washington knows him. So I don't think they're particularly surprising. I think, they do raise real questions as to his confirmation process. But then again, you have a Republican-controlled Senate. So despite the Democrats stepping up, many of them voting against him, he was able to get through. But again, all of this was known. And I think what this gets back to is the fact that in our system, you have an attorney general, whether it's Bill Barr, Jeff Sessions, or any other attorney general in American history. It is the attorney general who is in a conflicted position. They both represent the United States, and they are appointed by the president, who in these cases, whether it's Nixon or whether it's Trump or Clinton, they have to be in charge of an investigation. That is a real problem with the way we structure things in our system. So again, I don't find this particularly surprising. And I get back to the structure. You put somebody in there appointed by the president, it's not a big surprise.
Jeannie, it sounds like you're wanting to wholesale re-rendering of our government. Are you looking to completely restructure the whole thing? Are we having a new constitutional assembly?
Zev, you're absolutely. I'm writing about it right now. We need an Article 5. We need a reconstitution. And we've needed it a long time. And I think my frustration is that, and again, I'm guilty of this because I do a lot in the media, is this personality focused. It's Trump, it's Clinton. We've got a bad actor in office. Yes, but we have a system that put them in there for a reason. And if you want a serious conversation like the one you're having, they're incredibly rare in popular circles. And that is, a frustration. So absolutely, we need to rethink the structure, or I guarantee we have the same conversation when Trump is long gone.
Gary, that's quite a proposition there. What do you think?
Well, I've had this conversation with my who teach government law under political science, and one of Bruce Peabody, who's a talented scholar and colleague of mine, he's very fearful of a constitutional convention, as he believes that many of the things, the dark money, the under the table agreements, conflict of interest, would also permeate this constitutional convention. We may come out of that with something we may. The issue here for me is that we have a Republican president and a Republican Senate that is not properly vetting people that are reaching the bench or people in that position. It's a problem. And the issue in it.
You're cutting out a little bit there, and I don't want to lose what you're saying.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Go ahead.
So with Nixon, the difference was you had a Republican president and a Democratic Senate and a Democratic House. With Andrew Johnson, who by heritage was an Jacksonian Democrat, was dealing firmly with the Republican House and Senate. That isn't the case here with Trump. And there was some stuff in the news today that the odds of even the Democrats getting back the Senate in 2020 are very low. And so Trump has sort of a constitutional ideological shock absorber in the Senate that is protecting some of these things that we're talking about. I respectfully disagree. I don't think a constitutional convention is the answer. I'd rather deal with gerrymandering. I'd rather deal with Citizens United. But I'm very worried about where things stand with this. And again, don't forget 25 members of Nixon's administration, including the Attorney General and the Secretary of Commerce, sat in a federal prison, along with the Chief of Staff, along with his domestic affairs advisor, as well as his chief counsel. So if we have, but again, who's going to prosecute him? There's no way Republican Senate that confirmed him, even if the House were to impeach Barr, they're not going to impeach Barr. And what we need is another election, and 2020 will be very critical for that.
But if that's what we're going to be now, if that's what our system's going to be, where we're constantly in crisis and we have to wait for the next election to solve that crisis, are we going to be able to govern at all?
Depends on the results.
Jeannie, does that argument about dark money and infecting a constitutional convention, does that concern you? Do you think that there's a way to guard against it, or do you think that's just the way it is these days and we should absorb it as we think about a new way of ruling?
There's long been a fear of a runaway convention, and I don't think, by the way, we're anywhere close to a convention. But my point is not necessarily that we need the convention today. What I'm saying is that we need a serious concerted discussion in this country about things that are not sexy and not exciting, like campaign finance reform, like gerrymandering, like the fact that this has nothing to do with Donald Trump groping women, but this has to do with the fact that we have a structure that allowed somebody like that in a system like ours. And so until we have that discussion, we are going to be in the same position. And it's very, very difficult to have those discussions because, again, they are not particularly exciting to have. Very few people become political science or history majors because they want to talk about the Federal Convention in the 1780s, right? They want to talk about much more exciting things. But again, this is a critical issue. And so you can go back. There's a lot of things that can be done to address our systematic troubles. Many states, for example, and many countries, every generation allow for reconstitution. Why don't we have a conversation about that? They allow for addressing issues that arise in the Constitution as opposed to hoisting a Constitution for 200, 300 years on people. Let's not forget, our Constitution says nothing about a right to privacy. And let me be clear that if our current Supreme Court gets an abortion case or takes one, it's very likely on firm constitutional grounds they will overturn Roe v. Wade. Now that's because in the 1780s, nobody put a right to privacy in the Constitution, and we're living under that. So at a discussion, because I'm an academic, so I'm in favor of discussions about what's wrong with our system and how to correct it is what I'm interested in, and that's what I think we need to have.
So that's it's the right kind of solution, but it's impossible to see it happening right now. The Chinese and the Russians, I guess, are out there espousing the sort of idea of a benevolent dictatorship or a responsible dictatorship replacing democracy. Sort of the way the Chinese work, which is a political system inside a political party, or a political party inside a political system, where it's just one organism, rather than contesting elections on a regular basis in the way we do here. Is that a solution? Is that where we're sort of headed, that we can't really afford to continue the democracy because it's so easy to manipulate? I'm going to throw that in, Jeannie.
Gary
I
will
don't
start
think
with you.
I don't think that. I mean, you have some strong democracies in Western Europe. You have one in Japan. We're certainly dealing with Erdogan in Turkey. We're dealing with basically it's autocratic capitalism. It's not a communist society by any stretch of the imagination. But for me, the question is whether what is broken in our system. I agree. We have to have a serious discussion about the mechanisms and a lot of stuff that is minutia, a lot of stuff that is not sexy. The question is whether they can be remedied through system 2020, which is great. Some states will move its away from gerrymandering, allow a more nonpartisan commission to allocate those seats. I'm very fearful of a runaway convention. I understand the merits of trying to come back in the 21st century, an 18th century document. We have
cutting out
the
again.
ability to pass legislation.
You're back. It's fine.
I said we have the ability, I still think, to issue through elections, through legislation, and judicial rulings.
Tracy, you've got your ear to the
Hopefully.
ground, so in a big way with this huge Twitter following that you have. What is your sense of what people are thinking about as heading into 2020? It seems to me that they think it's going to be a free and fair election. It's probably not going to be that.
I wouldn't agree. I think people are very worried about Russian interference again. I mean, we have the president of the United States on a phone call with Putin, not even bringing up that issue the other day. So I think people in our Twitter circle are very worried that it will not be a fair election.
Mm-hmm. And there's reports today about rigged or at least hackable voting machines, that every single one of them is hackable. We're heading into a world where that one man, one vote thing just doesn't really exist anymore. And how do we contest that? How do we deal with that in our new framework, especially with someone like Donald Trump, who's very autocratic in the way he handles things in the White House? What's the path out of this, Jeannie?
It's funny. I've been, there's a great book by a scholar, a short book called "Is This Any Way to Run a Democratic Election?" that long precedes the 2016 election. And we have been fraught with challenges when it comes to are our elections free, transparent, and fair for a long time. And you talk about one person, one vote. The Electoral College by design violates the one person, one vote format. Because living in New York as I do, my vote is not worth as much as somebody in Rhode Island or Montana. So, on almost every one of the grounds political scientists discuss as what creates a democratic election, the U.S. falls fairly short. And there are ways to correct those things, but it takes a concerted effort on all of our part. And one thing, I think it's really clear that we have to make the case over and over again, especially to people in Tracy and your Twitter following, which is much more gigantic than mine, is that the onus is on us. We cannot simply blame people in DC and other people for what it is that we are getting from the media and elsewhere, because a lot of it is because we are not asking the right questions and we are not making the demands. And so, you can use many examples of this, but if you talk about the Electoral College, for instance, we've had 2 failures in the last 19 years of the Electoral College. And that is something that most people in a small d democracy wouldn't put up with. And yet in the United States, we have miraculously allowed that to continue without a concerted, real discussion as to whether over 200 years later, this method of electing presidents, which didn't make sense in the 1780s, whether it still makes sense today. And that is a real discussion. And I absolutely respect people who come to the conclusion it is the way to do it. But it's a discussion that has to be had There are people having it, but until you make the demand that the people on the 2020 campaign trail have these serious discussions and not talk about things like what kind of underwear they wear and whether they smoked pot in college, until you have those real discussions, we get sort of what we want. And you, Zev, know, as somebody who's produced a lot of shows, that, unless you're willing to get ratings, you can't be on the air. And so you give people what they ask for. So we are, is my point, and I include myself, responsible for the absence of some of these real discussions that we need to have.
I think it's really interesting. I mean, we started the conversation talking about dark money, about special interests affecting the government and changing policy, and basically corporations being able to buy the legislation they want. I would have thought at the start of the conversation that would be enough. You've added a whole bunch of additional layers of things, which would be great. But just even that first part, that special interest dark money thing, people like the Koch brothers, who have such a huge influence over everybody, and then especially the Republican Party, that they can buy legislation in almost any area that they want. And we have I don't know if you can read this graphic very easily, but there's, these are just some of the things that they support and oppose. And it's just an endless list of everything from social, they oppose Social Security, and they oppose the roads and national highway system. They want the repeal of the federal campaign finance laws. And yet, and they oppose things that I can't read over there on the other side. So there's a real, problem happening soon with the way these guys are trying to get their way, trying to buy the amount of laws that they want bought for the corporations. And Trump is just happy to sign away any legislation for a little bit of money, it seems. We really are, all of this is intersecting into a very dark place. Is there a way to sort of rescue ourselves just by focusing on dark money and special interests?
I don't know if
I
don't know if Gary's, but I don't want to interrupt him, but I absolutely think there is. It begins with a real discussion. Gary was just talking about Citizens United. That is a real serious concern. I would, venture to guess that at this point, the Supreme Court is not going to overturn its decision in Citizens United. That is hardly something that's going to happen. So if you want to change the system the way it is on dark money, that has to go through the legislative process, and that has to get through the Senate, which means that people have to get out and vote in 2020 for a Democratic Senate. And of course, as Gary just mentioned, the likelihood that the Democrats take the Senate in 2020 has become increasingly low, as potential contenders like Stacey Abrams and others have dropped out of contention or said they would rather focus on other things. And so that is the way to do it. It's the only way to do it. If Donald Trump is in the White House and it gets through the legislative process, I assume he would not sign it. So you would then need a Democratic president. But again, you need to have a serious concerted effort on the part of the American public to say, we want to clean up the system from dark money. We will only support House, Senate, and presidential candidates who are committed to that. And it's got to move its way through the process. So, all of which is to say, there's no easy answers to this, but I would venture to say the Supreme Court is not going to overturn Citizens United in any short-term period.
Right. And the Senate is not likely to flip. Unless you see it flipping, Gary, is there a chance you see it, a Democratic Senate in the future?
Agreed, but here's the issue. Look at the long term here. There's lots of issues. Keep in mind, the idea of even having minimum wage or Social Security is a debate that began in the 1890s. And we can talk about Citizens United being a problem. It may not be resolved in 2020 or 2022, maybe 2024, maybe 2028. So a lot of these issues don't just on one election. It has to do with willing to make it under the agenda. I think gerrymandering and I think Citizens United are significant, major issues that undermine the credibility of our democracy. And regarding the Electoral College, it's embedded in the Constitution. It is not the most democratic process, but in the smaller states, whether by the normal amendment process, are not going to accept it. So we have to operate within a system that we basically had. Now we've modified it. We basically allow direct election. We could attempt to pass a bill that might recalibrate the distribution. There's one proposal that might give the largest states 6 senators, give the smaller states a guaranteed 1 senator. but the ability to turn that into law. And
Oh, you're cutting out there.
I think we lost him.
Gary, we lost you, Gary. He's still there. We just keep jamming up a little bit.
Oh, there.
Yeah, so there are not many good options. And yes, perhaps 2020 is the only path out. And who knows? Bigger things, miracles have happened before, you know. It doesn't feel to me with the gerrymandering, even if some of it is resolved, we're going to be able to flip the Senate. And if Trump is still there, we may not even get to 2024. Tracy, any thoughts about the
Oh,
best way out?
Zeb, did you just say we might not get to a 2024?
Well, with a democracy, with a functioning democracy.
Oh, goodness. I have a young child at home. Let's hope we do.
I had one final question, Gary, about Nixon, because we had raised this thing before. There are parallels to what is going on with Nixon, and we survived that. We survived the fact that he refused to honor the subpoenas, and we also survived the fact that his attorney general was ultimately thrown in jail. So do you want to talk a little bit about, it's happened before, and we survived that, we might see it again.
Well, I want to start off with one that we had a Democratic Senate that was willing to invest. We had a Berger court that was willing to order that the tapes be order. And so that's sort of who makes up these various constituencies. My fear is not there. Now, there were 3 articles of impeachment committee. That obstruction of justice, that was abuse of power and contempt for Congress. Whether or not that, even if the House were to pass one or all 3 of these, then there's the issue whether or not the Senate would email. And I've asked several of my colleagues about that, and I think the jury still remains out. But what if the Senate says, impeach all you want, we're not having a trial? You can par. And so that sort of Senate and potentially the Supreme Court could be part of the problem here. Is what I'm most afraid of, because Trump's predictable. I know what Trump will attempt to do. He'll try to obstruct. He's going to try to. But the wild card here is the extent to which Senate and the Supreme Court could go against the grain and what we did in the Nixon era.
Yeah, right now it doesn't seem to be that kind of resistance is existing within the Republican Party. So, Jeannie, last thought for you on that: is there a way out? As we got out of Nixon, is there a way out of this one?
You know, let me just put on my political strategist hat for a minute and say something that's probably very unpopular in Democratic circles right now, particularly in the progressive left. But that, keep in mind, what Donald Trump wants more than anything else right now is Democrats talking impeachment, 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 because that gets his base out in 2020. And so from a political strategy perspective, I think Nancy Pelosi is absolutely right on this question. It is a dangerous path politically. Now, I am very sensitive to the fact that many Democrats, for good reason, feel, regardless of the political consequences to themselves, it is right to impeach and they should move forward on that. So you have Democrats in a real bind here. Political strategists will tell you that is not a good option for Democrats, and it's what Trump is sort of goading them into. And yet, there is the very realistic fact that many Democrats believe he obstructed justice. He may or may not have been guilty of conspiracy, and that he should be impeached and removed. So I think it has Democrats in a real bind here. And I think Democrats and everybody have to be very careful not to underestimate Donald Trump's political calculations here. This is somebody who has his finger on the pulse of the way our system works. He knows his base, and he has played that magnificently. So I would be very cautious of a movement, political strategy-wise, towards impeachment for those reasons.
Wow.
We're in agreement.
Yeah.
Well, I would disagree on that one, but I think if you guys are in agreement, that's good.
I'm sensitive to that, Zev. I'm sensitive to the fact that, many progressives feel that, if we lose, we go down because we did the right thing. And that's absolutely an honest opinion to have. But political strategy-wise, there's a reality here that needs to be kept into check.
Absolutely. If you're not going to win, why do it?
The only thing I would add, though, is his political base is small, and it is shrinking. So that percentage of people who will be voting is getting smaller all of the time.
Yeah, and it'll get smaller if the Democrats don't talk impeachment. But when they hammer on impeachment, the base gets out. I mean, that's his calculation. And you look at the China tariff war right now, it's hurting farmers terribly. They were a key constituency in the Midwest for him. So to Tracy's point, it is diminishing. And that's why he goes and meets with Nancy and Chuck and makes the infrastructure agreement, because he knows if the economy falters by November 2020, he is in big trouble.
Indeed, I can't see the Koch brothers supporting his infrastructure deal, but you're right. There's there's an attempt there at least to build his support. I think we have to end it because we're running out of time. But I want to thank you guys so much for coming on. I know you had time crunches today, so thank you so much, Gary Darden and Jeannie Zaino. And the last thought, Tracy, do you have a thought?
Well, thank you very much, because I learned so much from both of you when we have you on the show. And on a personal note, Jeannie, I wanted to tell you, I took my daughter and her friend shopping this weekend. And we were in the car, and her friend said to me, I'm the youngest of three daughters. And I said, okay. And she said, my one older sister's in high school, and my oldest sister's in college. And I said, oh, really? What college does she go to? And she said, she goes to Iona in New York.
Aww.
So I wanted to give you a little shout out for that. I thought of you this weekend.
Oh, that's so lovely. And as you know, I am one of 6 girls, so I love all the sisters there. But
you're one of 6 girls. Wow.
I
that
am.
must have been a household.
Very loud, very loud.
That's why you've got it so under control so much, I'm sure.
I have no doubt she's getting a wonderful education up there at Iona. So thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Tracy.
Well, again, thanks, guys. Really appreciate your time today. It's been a really interesting conversation, although it's a little depressing, to be quite honest, that we have to rethink the whole thing. But it's certainly food for thought, because I don't see any people really talking about the solutions right now. We talk a lot about the current conflicts and the little skirmishes we're having on a day-to-day basis. But the bigger picture is we've got a real problem in our country, but we've also got a problem globally where we're at war with Russia and possibly China, and we're not really figuring out solutions that make sense for that. So I appreciate your time, both of you, and thanks for coming on. And we'll have more Narrative Live, and we'll continue to discuss these sort of geeky, wonky things in the weeks to come. Thanks very much, everyone.
Bye, guys.
Have a good night.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.